Akwaaba, Jambo, Power and Solidarity. My name is Najee, and I am an intellectual Maroon. I want to explain that to you by reading Chapter 11, The Maroon Wars. W.E.B. Du Bois writes, while the British were fighting obstinately for dynastic disputes in Europe, they were really in the War of Spanish Succession and in the 7 Years' War fighting for profit through world trade and especially the slave trade. In 1713, they gained, by the coveted Treaty of Asiento, the right to monopolize the slave trade from Africa to the Spanish colonies. In that century, they beat Holland to her knees and started her economic decline. They overthrew the Portuguese in India and finally, by the middle of the century, overcame their last rival in India, the French. In the 18th century, they raised the slave trade to the greatest single body of trade on earth. Cyril Hampshire states, distasteful as it is to present-day thinking, it must be admitted that the West Indian Slave Society worked and produced the great wealth that helped to finance the revolution in industry which turned Britain into a modern state. The exports of sugar, coffee, cotton, and other tropical products helped to finance the defeat of Napoleon. For by 1810, Britain controlled all the Dutch and French colonies except Saint-Domingue, which as well as her own. Though Britain and the 13 colonies in America materially prospered from this damnable activity, it was at the sacrifice of great peace and tranquility, for there was the ever-present and evolving Pan-African revolution being carried forward by the black slave from one extremity of Britain's American empire to the other, as well as those valiant and righteous struggles that were being waged by the African in the Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Dutch colonies. Here again we draw from the abundant intellectual wellspring of Du Bois. In the 18th century, there were 15 such revolts in Portuguese and Dutch South Africa, in the French colonies, in the British possessions, in Cuba, and little islands like St. Lucia. There were pitched battles and treaties between the British and the Black Maroons, and finally, there was a rebellion in Haiti which changed the face of the world and drove England out of the slave trade. We have previously mentioned the Maroon struggle for land and self-determination in the preceding chapter. Now let us examine this particular aspect of the early years of Pan-African revolution in the Western Hemisphere. The Maroon resistance movement in English-controlled territory in the Caribbean began in the days of Oliver Cromwell, 1655, and was carried on through the reigns of Charles II, James II, William III, Queen Anne and George I, George II, and George III, culminating in the Maroon Wars of 1690, 1730-39, and 1795. The following is a brief outline of this valiant struggle for black liberation. Before I be a slave, I'll be burned in my grave. The most noted Maroons are those who escaped from the abominable horrors of the plantations and took refuge in the mountains of Jamaica. The designation Maroon is derived from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning untamable, wild, unruly, which is what they considered an African to be who would not submit to the demonic will of the slave master. To black freedom fighters in that area, it became a term of pride and affection which signified that they never intended to be controlled by another. To confirm their fervent commitment to the principle of liberty or death, the Maroons of Jamaica adopted the cutlass as the symbol of their struggle for land and self-determination. From 1545 to 1864, there were over 50 Maroon communities, 50 Maroon communities scattered throughout the swamps and mountain forests of the American colonies in such places as South and North Carolina, Virginia, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Guadeloupe, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and Brazil, to name a few. Many of these Maroons fought on the side of the red man against the European colonial usurpers. Jamaica's Maroon settlements headed this list because its wild mountain terrain provided an ideal sanctuary for runaway slaves. Descendants of these fascinating communities remained steadfast and continued to grow from generation to generation while wreaking havoc on the European settler colonies. Because of the many Maroon rebellions, England nearly lost Jamaica as a colonial possession. White plantation owners on the island of Jamaica lived in constant fear of the threat of collective slave rebellion, for they were ever conscious of the fact that high up in the Blue Mountains were the well-organized and disciplined fighting forces of Maroon guerrilla bands. In 1673, when 300 African slaves rose in revolt, killed their master and 13 other whites, the planters were virtually thrown into a state of dismay and panic. This type of revolt occurred throughout all of the American colonies with recurrent frequency. On the island of Jamaica, each dawn revealed the Maroon visitation of the night before. Descending the mountains in swift night raids, the guerrilla bands, armed with carefully planned information received from the slaves who were involved in their intricate intelligence operations, carried on from plantation to plantation, would replenish their food and ammunition by raiding crops, livestock, and firearms. Often these fierce warriors would kill the slave masters and overseers and assist the slaves in escaping to the hills. Many a tropical night sky was brilliantly lighted by the highly efficient fighting tactic of guerrilla warfare, often trapping the British forces in ambush after ambush, then mysteriously vanishing into the woods as though they had never been present. This left the whites in a state of dread. To really appreciate the Maroon method of warfare, it must be remembered that these men were for the most part armed with weapons that were considered antiquated against Great Britain. The acknowledged mistress of the seas, whose empire at that time covered approximately 1/4 of the then known world. These relentless warriors were the originators of guerrilla warfare and camouflage ambush techniques in the Western Hemisphere, and were past masters of their creation. The First Maroon War. In 1655, the English took Jamaica from Spain. At the time of this acquisition, the mountains were already teeming with some 1,500 or more runaway slaves, whose numbers were being swelled daily by a continuous stream of Africans seeking freedom. These Maroons continued the struggle against British troops under the leadership of a black man named Juan Dubolo, whom the Spaniards referred to as Juan de Bolas. The military skill and courage of these Africans laid the foundation for the Maroon Wars that were to follow in the wake of their dynamic strike for liberty. The blacks could probably have taken complete control of the island had it not been for the fierce tribalism which often divided them. On some occasions, certain Africans from different geographical locations gave into their old tribal rivalries and refused to fight side by side with each other. From this, we, the Africans who strive for liberation today, must learn a great lesson and determine amongst ourselves that we shall not repeat this destructive mistake again. This is difficult, but it must be done if we are to win the war. Herein lies one of our main weaknesses as a people. This sickness must be, and by the grace of Almighty God, it will be healed. Even if the Creator has to turn every force in the world against us to force us to join onto our own. In 1660, largely due to this demoralizing tribalism, Colonel Dubolo and about 150 of his soldiers surrendered to the English in exchange for pardon, land, and freedom. But most of the Maroons stayed in the mountains and continued to wage guerrilla war. At the outset of the reign of James II in 1685, 150 slaves revolted in Jamaica and took to the hills. In 1690, some 400 rose up in arms and joined the Maroons in the Blue Mountains. Between 1663 and the Treaty Agreement of 1739, there were at least 10 major slave revolts occurring within the context of the ongoing war between the Maroons and Britain. In 1730, the English launched an intensified military campaign against the Maroons with the intended purpose of annihilating the guerrilla bands and obliterating their communities. British regiments were transported to the island from various locations in the empire, and a bounty of $28 was offered for each Maroon's head delivered. $28. This all-out offensive is recorded in British annals as the First Maroon War. The result was Britain's formal recognition of Maroon independence in the Treaty of 1739, which we will discuss later in this chapter. General Cudjoe and his Akan cadre. During the revolt of 1690, there emerged a bold, strong, resourceful leader of the Blue Mountain Maroons, a slave from the Coromantee tribe of Ghana named Cudjoe. General Cudjoe, or Cudjoe, is described as a short, stocky, powerfully built man with a humped back. He was a remarkably skilled technician of guerrilla warfare who spearheaded the Maroon Revolutionary movement through 50 years of intensive struggle. This warrior chieftain was a supreme tactician who organized and systematized the Maroon army into a highly sophisticated fighting machine. Colonel C.L.G. Harris respectfully says of him, "As the first successful revolutionary in the New World, and he had many followers and imitators, General Cudjoe of the Maroons lit the brightest torch of true freedom for all the New World. Through a brilliant military commander and administrator of the highest caliber, he was sometimes unpredictable and irrational, and could be ruthless, even brutal to his own people. Yet at times he was ambivalent in his dealings with whites, and all too easily seduced by their call for peace and friendship." For this ex-slave, mighty giant that he was, suffered from the mental disorder of extreme contradictions, which is so often prevalent in a mind which has once been disarranged by its former oppressor. Still, General Cudjoe's commitment to combat the brute force of the slave masters and establish independence for his Maroon followers was impeccable. Through rivers of blood, over jagged mountains, and through myriad dangers untold, he led his forces to victory after victory, and lived to be well over 80 years of age after the signing of the Treaty of 1739. Cudjoe and many of his comrades were Akan people from the Coromantee tribe of Ghana. The Coromantee were a strong and highly developed militaristic group of Africans, superbly proficient in jungle warfare. Generally, they had a fierce intolerance to slavery, which they had never known prior to their captivity in the Americas. The Coromantee provided most of the leaders in the rebellion and insurrections among the slaves in Jamaica. Here is a partial list of Jamaican Maroon leaders: General Cudjoe, his brother, Akwaaba, named in honor of Akjangpong, the Akan designation for creator of heaven and earth. Another brother, Johnny, and his formidable and brilliant sister, Nanny. The leaders of the Maroons on the windward part of the island were Captains Koiko, Kofi, and Kishi, to name a few. The Maroon Treaty of 1739. After nearly 10 years of intensified warfare with the Maroons, the English were forced to sue for peace. Because of the superiority in guerrilla warfare, which had been consistently demonstrated for over 3/4 of a century by the new African freedom fighters on the island of Jamaica, the British had no alternative but to ask the Maroons, whom they had been unable to defeat and subdue, to make peace. On March 1st, 1739, diplomacy succeeded where brute force had failed, and the Maroons were declared free and independent forever. The terms of the treaty granted them 2,500 acres of land and the status of a Maroon state within the Jamaican colony, with the freedom to plant, harvest, and sell any crop but sugar. In return, Trelawney, British governor on the island at the time, required them to return all fugitive slaves after the date set forth in the treaty in exchange for monetary compensation to aid in the suppression of future slave revolts, receive and maintain at least 2 white superintendents in the Maroon territory, and come to the defense of the island in times of foreign invasion. Hampshire says, "It is strange that the Maroons accepted these conditions, but they were exhausted and their women and children were near starvation." In the book Maroon Societies, Richard Price records, following the treaties, these same Jamaican Maroons bought, sold, and owned substantial numbers of slaves, hunted new runaways for a price, managed to gain the hatred of much of the slave population, and in many respects may have deserved their common post-treaty nickname, the King's Niggers. This contradictory behavior on the part of the Maroons was created by the bizarre circumstances and strangeness of the slavery phenomenon, which engendered the psychological schizophrenia or wearing conflicts and confusion within the mind and spirit of what was originally a free and independent people. We are not here seeking to overlook or excuse this imbalanced behavior, but rather to learn from and transcend it. We must somehow come to understand the real meanings of these happenings and extract from them the object lessons that will make us stronger, wiser, and better Africans today. The mental genocide, physical and spiritual abuses of chattel bondage affected even the strongest-willed blacks. During that period, Caribbean islands like Jamaica were main centers of the seasoning process, where the slave was beaten, tortured, and brainwashed into dehumanized submission, so that even in the case of some of the freedom-fighting slaves who warred to the death for self-determination and independence, there was yet a great deal of confusion of mind and behavior. There are those who would discount the real significance of the Maroon Wars on the basis of their acceptance of the terms of the treaty. But to do this would be unwise, for it would blot out a very important feature of the new African Revolution. Though I do not even pretend to fully comprehend, or am I disposed to excuse the Maroons' contradictory behavior, these are the thoughts which come to mind in regards of the issue. No one really knows the full impact of slavery on the psyche and its total distortion of the otherwise normal and logical function of the mind of the enslaved. It must be remembered that the white slave masters systematically stole our minds and a portion of our souls, as well as our bodies. The seasoning method used in the island was designed to strip the African of all his humanity and loyalty to self and kind. So thoroughly was the job done that even in the great black leaders of the current 20th century, we still view contradictions in our most dedicated freedom fighters. Yet we must be wise enough not to dismiss all the wonderful and good things done for the race by such magnificent personages as the Honorable Marcus Garvey, the Honorable Drew Ally, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and a host of others too numerous to mention here. These mighty men and women gave so completely of themselves to advance the race further and further towards our eventual goal of nationhood and black liberation. It is in the holy deeds of these saints that we must glory and strengthen ourselves as a people. As regards to their mistakes and contradictions, we must move to a higher plateau in our continuing struggle by learning from and resolving never to repeat them again. This is the legacy of our time. The good deeds of our ancestors are our guideposts to freedom. Their mistakes and contradictions are the warning signs of what lies ahead. Learn from them and let us move ever forward in the principle of Pamoja Tutushinda. We will win together, that all the world may see that we are one. Tuko Pamoja. From the Maroon contradiction that we must assuredly learn our lesson so that we can never be fragmented against each other again, as has been so recently demonstrated in the succumbing of many of our leaders and black organizations to the ego and personal gratification manipulations of the United States government's COINTELPRO offensive. Here is where the supreme power of discipline comes in. Individual blacks and or organizations must come to embrace the concept of the new African creed, which speaks of fashioning victory in concert with my brothers and sisters. This was the principle taught by our high culture systems of the ancient world, the divine law of the collective, which was basic to the African's nature and behavioral manifestations prior to captivity. Those of us who are serious students of human nature understand that the first law of the individual is the law of self-preservation and self-aggrandizement. This is the law of the jungle, the law of the caveman, the law of the untamed and underdeveloped spirit. The first law of the community, as taught by our ancient high culture system, is umoja, unity, oneness, based on the principle of collective participation and cooperative gain. This is the basic difference between a civilized and an uncivilized society. The law of the collective places man above the level of the lower animals. The law of the individual puts him on the level of the dog-eat-dog behavioral patterns of the beast of the field. This is the realm to which many Africans and their societies were reduced after our enslavement and perpetual bondage. Remnants of this degeneration of the high African collective ideal and consciousness are still evident in black communities today. This is perhaps our greatest weakness, and is starkly manifested in our extreme tribalism, egotism, and organizational exclusivity. This must be overcome if we are to rise to the position of power to which the race is destined. Truly, as a people, we have far more in common than we have differences. Thus, we should ever seek that ground of commonality in our individual and organizational relationships with each other, thereby maximizing our efforts to constructively function together for the total good of the whole. In the words of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, our attitude must be one aim, one God, one destiny. The Second Maroon War. Not all Maroons, especially those black who were still on the plantation, were in agreement with the treaty. Slave uprisings and revolts continued to be prevalent in Jamaica. In 1760, over 1,000 Africans rose in rebellion under the leadership of a brother named Taki and killed 60 whites, once again striking terror in the hearts of the planters. In 1765, black people on 17 plantations arose and struck for freedom. The very next year, some Coromantee slaves revolted. In 1776, the year of the signing of the United States Declaration of Independence, several hundred slaves rose in insurrection on two separate parts of the island. In 1795, the Second War between the Maroons and the British colonial government in Jamaica erupted. This was lasted from July to December of that year. Over 1,500 British troops and 3,000 militia were mustered in an effort to subdue the Maroons of Cudjoe's settlement, then called Trelawney Town, but they failed. Finally, the English imported bloodhounds from Cuba, and the Maroons were forced to surrender and return to their designated boundaries as defined in accordance with the Treaty of 1739. Immediately following this event, Coromantee blacks who were enlisted in the colonial government's West India Regiment mutinied and took to the hills. Their leader was called Chamba. In 1815, Igbo slaves captures from Nigeria laid plans for a slave revolt. There were at least 3 other conspiracies on the island between 1823 and 1824. In 1831 occurred the largest slave uprising in Jamaican history. Over 200,000 African people, led by Daddy Sharp, rose in rebellion against the British colonial government, causing the English to step up their efforts in abolishing slavery in the declining sugar island of the Caribbean. This ongoing revolutionary activity on the part of the blacks cost the British government a great deal of money, lives, and resources, not to mention the taxing mental strain of the ever-present threat of recurring slave insurrections. The productivity of the plantations was seriously hampered for a time, and travel into the interior of Jamaica was dangerous. During the First Maroon War alone, the British spent over $700,000, quite a sum in those days. PMS Sherlock writes, "For the first time in the history of the Americas, a metropolitan power was forced to recognize the rights of their subjects to independence. This happened a half a century before the North Americans gained their independence. This happened a half a century before the North Americans gained their independence, and 70 years ahead of the blacks of Haiti. This is essence in the meaning of the Treaty of 1739, which brought an end to the First Maroon War. In 1865, there was an insurrection of Africans in the Morant Bay area under the leadership of Paul Boogly. Eventually, on August 6, 1962, Jamaica became the first British territory in the Caribbean to gain national independence. Roll call of African freedom fighters in colonial times. The widespread passion for freedom among the slaves and the will to struggle for it created a long list of black freedom fighters from this period. Following is a few of them. On the island of Hispaniola in 1545, an African with the slave name of Diego de Campo led a large Maroon community of approximately 7,000 people. His guerrilla band defeated many Spanish troops sent against them, burned down sugar mills, the main colonial product, and set many slaves free. This Mite's warrior chieftain was feared by the whites throughout the island, and they offered to sue for peace. In 1650, Africans of northeastern Brazil revolted and proclaimed themselves the independent Republic of Palmares, named in honor of the abundance of palm trees in the region of their liberated territory, which provided them with food and other products they used in trade with the red man and some of the coastal settlements. This black republic endured from 1650 to 1697. In 1654, the Portuguese retook northeast Brazil from the Dutch and attempted to take Palmares from the African. After failing at this some 25 times, they were forced to recognize the independence of this new African republic. The most outstanding head of state in the government of Palmares was a brilliant administrator and brave warrior named Zumbi. Africans in the Dutch held South American colony of Suriname, Guinea, fought for their liberty in a 36-year war. Suriname, Guinea, and fought for their liberty in a 36-year war. The Dutch, unable to subdue the freedom fighters by force, sued for peace and concluded an amicable treaty in 1761 with Captain Ado, leader of the revolutionary forces whom the Dutch called Bush Negroes. Of course, we can never forget the Santo Domingo Revolution of 1791 to 1803, which evolved into the total abolition of slavery there and the existence of the first independent black nation in the Western Hemisphere. As we reflect on this period of African history, names such as Toussaint and Dessalines of Haiti, Daga of Trinidad, Ado of Suriname, Cujo, Nani, Akompong, Dubolo, Taki, Paul, Bugle, Chamba and Daddy Sharp of Jamaica, Zumbi of Palmeiras, Diego de Campo of Hispaniola, Gabriel Procer, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and Harriet Tubman of the United States, and a host of others too numerous to mention here. Flash across the consciousness in brilliant succession a legacy more precious than gold, more vital to us than all the material treasures of the world today. For in the good acts of these saints, though they were not perfect, we behold the various embodiments and manifestations of the true African spirit, the spirit of excellence and power. In the preceding discussions, we have mentioned just few of the incalculable examples of the new African Revolution and the ever-present struggle for land and self-determination, which was then, even as now, carried on throughout the Americas, culminating in the founding of many independent black nations in the Western Hemisphere, and the recent creation of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, March 31st, 1968. This subject will be set forth in more detail in a forthcoming work entitled The Rape of Africa and the Settling of the New World. The middle to the latter part of the 18th century marked one of the greatest periods of new African revolutionary activity. At the same time that the western sector of the British Empire was being plagued by the constant revolt of the ongoing black liberation struggle, she became embroiled in a controversy with the 13 colonies of North America, which led to a full-scale revolutionary war on the part of her wayward child. This conflict led to the creation of the United States of America. We will now proceed to discuss this event and its true relationship to African people in the succeeding and final chapter of this book. Tuko Pamoja, Abibifahodie.